Now, for those of you who don't remember this, programs were distributed by publishing their source code or their bytecode, and players would have to type in basic code or the hexadecimal values of assembly instructions in order to run them. It's kind of hard to remember those days anymore. Certainly today, running games requires Apple's permission instead of hacking its machine output registers. But I also think that today it's hard to remember the initial experience of playing games like Commander Keen or Wolfenstein 3D or Doom, id's early titles. We often talk about them as if they were entirely original, that they came out of nowhere and overtook us. But nothing is really original, is it? Keen, for example, translated the smooth-scrolling 2D platformers of console and coin-op games for DOS, bringing that experience into the home and maybe more importantly into the workplace. Wolfenstein popularized the first-person shooter by borrowing the very concept of a first-person player from games as old as 1976 Colossal Cave Adventure or 1980s Battlezone. And Doom's network death matches look back on the traditions of playground games and tabletop games, among others. So, borrowing some of the worst tendencies of technologists, video games and video game fans tend to look forward incessantly. Better ray tracing, higher resolution, more verisimilitude. We rarely look back and reflect on the influence and impacts of our past. And when we do, it's usually only in a kind of stupefied awe. We call designers gaming legends, and we worship them as idols without really understanding the details of what they did and why they did it. Now, in mixed company like this, we have people from a wide variety of backgrounds, not only intellectually, but also even within the academy from different fields. I usually try to make sure I get in references to both assembly programming and ancient Greek. Some of you know this, and they can attest to it. So I've got assembly covered, but this time I'm gonna go for Latin instead of Greek. We'll mix it up a little bit. The word legend, that idea of the legend, comes from a Latin word legere. And on the surface, it just means to read. A legend is something you read. But it also uncovers the idea of observing something, of beholding something, of catching up on something, of bringing things from the past into the present through attention and careful study. True legends also seem to know where they've come from. John Romero has a history of looking back in this way, of paying attention to legend. Since id, he's been actively involved in contemporary development on mobile games and on MMOs, but he also has an interest in preservation and archival, particularly of the Apple II games of his salad days. Today, Romero is here not to rule over us as a master of doom, but to reflect on his experience as a subject of his own masters. Please join me in welcoming John Romero.
All right, thanks for having me here today, everybody. I'm really excited. I have not given a talk in a while, so this is a good refresh. Okay, let's get this up here. All right. This is a talk that is titled Masters Among Us. Yeah, the blue screen of death is not good. There we go. I think okay. Let us begin. Mozart was a great person, great musician. Lived a long time ago, and he made a lot of music. Of his music, a lot of people don't know that we actually only have about 10% of his output. which is kind of scary. You know, he was a brilliant person, and I'm sure that if we had more of his output, we would probably learn more about his genius. It's unfortunate that that didn't happen. Imagine if Mozart were alive right now. You know, what could we learn from Mozart if he was among us now, instead of having to look back on his past work? Louis Sullivan was an amazing architect. His buildings were very controversial when they came out. But Louis Sullivan was very inspirational for Frank Lloyd Wright in his career, and you can see a lot of Louis Sullivan in Mr. Wright's architecture. But he knew that that's where he got his inspiration. Right now, our masters walk among us in the game industry. Actually, you know, this is a young industry, and it's not so old that a lot of our early masters from the early '80s, they're still here, and I think it's important for us to think about what they've done, and for us to actually learn from them instead of just steadily marching forwards and looking at, you know, last year's games. Does anybody here know who Soja Belly is? A few hands out there. Soja Belly, he's an Iranian programmer, and Soja Belly was instrumental in the very early '80s, in fact in 1980, on the Apple II, basically creating really great games like these ones that you see here, Space Eggs and Phantoms 5, and a lot of other games. In fact, Nasser had created, I think, about 9 games in 1 year, furiously chain smoking and drinking coffee and pounding out 6502 assembly language. And he actually pounded out his assembly language in a mini assembler. He never actually had a program that he ran and kept his source code in. He didn't have source code. He just typed directly into a mini assembler. And it was interesting that Nasser, because of the way that he operated, Nasser had to keep an entire game in his head. He couldn't just look back at source and have comments and kind of look and see, you know, what he was thinking a few days ago. He had to make his games pretty quick because it all had to be in his head. And to be able to write these kinds of games and keep it all in your head with no source code is on a crazy genius level almost. Even though the programming on the Apple II was not of the level of programming required to basically program a screen on the Atari 2600, creating a game the size of some of the stuff that Nasser had done required a lot of work and thought that people back then were not used to having. You know, that practice just was not common. So you know, he just did what he had to do, which is just iterate and build upon this code that he was building. It was interesting. He used to basically fill his memory up with no operation codes, and then just put pieces of code all over the place, so he could kind of extend his code out, and it would kind of fall through to the next piece of code. But yeah, it's interesting to look back at some of the techniques that he used to create his games. You know, the Apple II was a pretty limited system. It had a 1 megahertz processor, and it had no video adapters. It had basically a frame buffer, and you wrote pixels into that buffer, and you couldn't write them in a nice, friendly way on the bit level. Pixels were made up of a bit or 2 bits next to each other that did crazy things, and you know, you can kind of see from the Phantoms 5 screen some fringing artifacts. The slowness of the machine basically dictated, you know, if you're going to do a full scrolling screen like Phantoms 5, you had to come up with some tricks. And what Nasser did, if you're looking at the Phantoms 5 screen there, was he interlaced every other line for the background, and the other, let's say the even lines, were for the foreground moving objects, like the jet fighter that you flew around. And you know, those kinds of tricks were employed on other systems as well. It was not nice and neat and clean the way that you would like throw polys through an API today and just kind of you see the whole thing up on the screen. Nasser was also instrumental not only in the beginning of the game industry back in 1980, but he continued to make games, and in 1987, well, in 86, he went to Square in Japan, and he created Final Fantasy. He created Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. He was basically the only programmer at Square when they close to when they started. And then he made Secret of Mana in 1993. So he continued to make games, and he continued to build on prior knowledge, and it was great to see him come back, but he's gone right now. I don't know where he's at. I think he's in Sacramento, but he hasn't been on the net, and he kind of just likes to travel. So it would be nice to spend time and talk to Nasser about some of these early concepts and how he tackled them. Bill Budge. People here know who Bill Budge is? Some people? Okay. Bill Budge was another early programmer that had a lot of influence. In fact, he was pretty good friends with Nasser Jabeli. Bill Budge was a guy that originally he played around with some 3D, some early 3D programming. But one of the really great things he did was create the pinball construction set, and then he used Raster Blaster, his pinball game, as the kind of the blueprint for what pinball construction set should be. And people had not seen a program as sophisticated as this on an 8-bit machine ever until that point. This was allowing a person to create something that felt beyond what you should be able to do on a computer. And he did this in 1982. And Bill, luckily, he actually works down the street from me in San Mateo at Sony, and he's a really friendly guy, and you can go out to lunch with him, and he's really cool, and he will talk about his history, and that's really nice to be able to ask him about the graphics page articles that he wrote in Soft Talk magazine, or what he did at 3DO when he was programming 3D there. And he works mainly on tools nowadays, but I try and keep up on Bill, and he's actually easy to keep track of because he tweets all the time, and he's a big runner. Just in case you guys wanted to know, he's at Bill or at bbudge, I think, on Twitter. Bill B. Okay, at Bill B. So Mark Rimmel is another guy who was pretty influential a long time ago. He also started on the Apple II, and in fact he worked on games using Nasser's programming back at Sirius. And Mark did some really great stuff. He moved over to the Atari 2600, programmed some games, and then he went to Midway, and these are his earliest games. At Midway, he was responsible for NBA Jam. He was, WrestleMania. He was responsible for Total Carnage, which was kind of a Robotron type clone. And he just kind of continued, and then he created a franchise that Midway had been pushing for years, which is called Ballers, which is a basketball game, because Mark is a big basketball nut. He loves sports, especially basketball. And just recently, last year, I believe it was last year, Midway finally went under after about 30 years in running, and Mark was there for 20 of those years. And that is tough when you're working at a company for 20 years, and that's the only real home that you've had, and you find yourself out and having to figure out, what am I going to do now? I've been making games for a long time. I've been making a lot of basketball games. Is basketball something I'm really excited about doing some more, or do I want to do something new? Mark is a guy that is not too difficult to get in touch with, which is great. Sitting and interviewing him and asking him questions is something that is doable for people. I think is important. But we do have an issue that some of these people that are legends and our masters have already passed on. Dan Bunton was a seminal game designer at the beginning of the industry, and was responsible for creating many of the different types of blueprints, design patterns that we've come to use in later games. The game Mule, which was an exercise in supply and demand economics, actually drew upon about 3 of Dan's earlier games, and tried to basically perfect them, and was an amazing 4-player game. And there's a version of Mule right now. I think it's called planetmule.com. You can basically get it and run it and play it over the internet and everything if you want to actually experience it now today. And it's approved by Dan Bunton's children, who maintain an ozarksoftscape.com site to kind of honor Dan's memory. James Nichols. Do anyone here know who Jim Nichols is? It's kind of more of an obscure name. Jim Nichols was also an early Apple II pioneer, and Jim was basically probably the best programmer of music and sound on the Apple II, and because that was such a strength of his, he actually continued to do sound in a lot of games. In fact, he had done sound for some of my games, like Wolfenstein on the Macintosh, and he paired up with a guy named Steve Hales, and they created a company, and those Hales drivers are basically sound drivers used in a ton of games. So Jim Nichols' code actually lives on still. These games here, Bug Attack and Microwave in the top left and Zany Golf in the bottom right, they were really cool games. And the one, especially Microwave in the top left was kind of the tour de force on an Apple II. It was the only game that actually you could play very, very smoothly, and it played music constantly while you were playing the game, and it played music as good as an Apple II pretty much can play music without being completely dedicated to not doing anything else. And the song was basically the Star Wars Cantina song. Just kind of use something everybody knew, as opposed to, say, the game The Bilestowed, which you used for release, and unless you really know that song, it sounded really bad. Bill Williams. So there's no picture of Bill, and I know that there are people out there that are probably in Bill's family that have pictures of Bill, but they're not on the internet. Those pictures, you're not going to find a picture of Bill Williams out there. And Bill Williams was a great game designer that did some games for Synapse back in the early '80s, and up till about '86, '87 on the Amiga in the bottom right. Alley Cat was the game in the top left that was a real kind of a breakout game for him right after Necromancer, which is the top right game. And Bill, he was really inventive, and he was doing things really different, mimicking, with the Alley Cat. That was kind of a really different game. There was nothing like it. You basically are a cat jumping around on these cans, and you jump on top of the fence and jump into a window. And when you jump in the window, it's another game, and you have to kind of solve the game and get back out and try and solve the building, before going to another building. Bill's designs kind of mimicked the design patterns of the early arcade days, when pretty much there was just massive creativity. Everybody could make whatever they wanted. There were no restrictions. So Bill was revered for his pioneering in that way. People know Gunpei Yokoi? Some people know Gunpei? Yes, Gunpei was awesome. Gunpei is the guy that Shigeru Miyamoto learned from. He's the guy that was a huge inspiration for the way that Shigeru's design philosophy evolved. The game and game set watch on the left, Game Boy on the right, huge contributions. The D-pad is from Gunpei. Everybody's been using D-pads for decades, and that's his invention. He had a theory of design that great games don't need to come from insane technology, because the game design is more important than the actual tech that it's built on, as long as it's a decent technology and it's a really great game. And that was how Shigeru learned, really focus on the game, make sure the game is solid. Whatever the tech is, we're always pushing forward in technology. There's always whatever the latest graphics card or APIs that we're pushing on, but put a really, really great game on top of that. So, what have we learned from his philosophy? We've learned how to make a game like Farmville, a game that has been cloned so many times, but it's simple graphics, it's 2D, it's very simple and shallow, but it is massively popular. On Facebook, you'll see there are at least 20-some million people every day playing Farmville, which is pretty crazy. If you count, if you thought World of Warcraft had some numbers, Farmville is double that, at least. The Wii Fit, we've learned that these alternate input devices are kind of cool. They inspire a different kind of design and a different reason for interacting with a computer device or an entertainment device. People remember Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. But do people actually remember Dave Arneson, who created D&D with Gary the entire way, Gary's name was on the fronts of all of those books, and a lot of people remembered Gary's name. But Dave was right there at the very beginning, back in the 60s when they created Chainmail and evolved that into, Dungeons and Dragons in 1974. So remembering these people is very important, and it would have been nice to be able to sit and talk to these guys about how they evolved their design processes, but they're not around anymore. Sid Saxon is a very prolific board game designer. I'm sure that some of you have heard of the game Acquire, which is kind of a classic title. Sid Saxon passed away not too many years ago, and his family didn't really recognize his genius or his contributions, and they basically just auctioned off everything he had, which includes prototypes of games he hadn't released, all of his notes, all of his papers, things that should really belong in a game museum or an archive. And they're just gone, and you can't get them back. They're auctioned, and they are gone. And that is really sad to have that happen. It's happened multiple times, in fact. So we have many lessons, there's many lessons that we have to learn from our masters. But our masters worked within a lot of constraints. The technologies that they developed their titles on, there were a lot of technical constraints on them, but they tried to break out of those constraints and do really amazing things. The Atari 2600, for example, was a very difficult system to program. That hardware was made for only 2 games. It was made for combat and it was made for Pong. It wasn't meant to do anything else. Atari basically decided that, we're going to put out this device, and there's a chip inside the device that's going to hold the game. Actually, let's put 2 games on that chip. And then they decided, we'll make more money if we just don't put that chip in there and take that chip and put 2 chips in cartridges that we can plug in, and then we can sell the unit and then 2 games. So we sell 3 things. And that was the design plan or the business plan around the 2600, was basically sell the unit and 2 games, you're done. And, there were little things that the programmers learned to tweak this machine and to do things that they never thought that it could do. There was just enough flexibility in there that you saw an explosion of games to the point where it collapsed the industry in 1984. The Apple II had a lot of limitations, and a lot of, just like the Bill Budge and Soja Belly and Dan Gorlin and Doug Smith and all these great programmers, they had to find ways of doing things quickly to make a really smooth, fun game. Not only are they having to focus on the technical, the very specifics of 6502 assembly language and how to get, squeeze the most out of the machine and still be able to fit a game inside of the machine, they're also having to possibly, if they could, innovate in design while being a master at assembly language. And back then, that's just an issue in general. The lower that language goes and the closer to the hardware you are, the less of a grand design that you can implement, especially when you're one person. So, so the Apple II had a lot of limitations, but it was, people were breaking free of those limitations as much as they could. So Wheeler Dealers is was a game from Dan Bunton, and it was one of the, it was made in 1978, came on a cassette, and it implemented basically the first 4-player multiplayer game through this custom hardware that came with it, which was to enable like 4 paddles to, 4 players could play this at the same time. Dan Bunton broke out of the Apple II, which was limited to just 2 paddles, and he said, why don't we, I'm just going to make some hardware and let people, let them buy the hardware with the game so they can play this game the way I've kind of designed it to be played. And that was, the beginning of, Guitar Hero. This is where we kind of finally come, decades later to the idea that, maybe some custom hardware isn't so bad to support these game designs. Maybe you can break free of our constraints in some way, but, we have to make a profit and we have to design this stuff to be cheap. But even something as powerful as that, guitar there has ignited, a piece of kind of a new, basically the music, genre basically, and so it's great to see that people are trying to break free still of their limitations. But today's designers, they're far more constrained now than we were 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, we had hardware and we had complete direct hardware access, and on not on the 2600, but on computers beyond the 2600, the Apple IIs and the Atari 26, or the Atari 800s and the Commodore 64s, we had a frame buffer and we could put down every pixel that we wanted to, and that was it was a blank canvas for us. Not only did we have the wide open frame buffers to do what we wanted to, we had the arcades and the designs that were coming through the arcades to show us the incredible diversity of game design that could be done. A lot of these arcade machines were using the same chip, the 6809 chip, but the game designs behind these machines were incredibly diverse, especially in the early 80s. They were as unbridled in their design patterns as the Atari 2600 programmers were trying to be with their inventions. And when you look at these games and you look at Dig Dug on the left here and Robotron, and you think about Pac-Man on the end there. Pac-Man came out in a time where the game of the day, you could basically go in an arcade and look at any game, and you're shooting aliens, you're just killing aliens, and a lot of the times you're doing that in black and white. And when Pac-Man came out, it was in color, and it was not about shooting aliens, it was about running away from monsters and eating dots, and that was a really powerful design lesson, at least for me, because I was used to playing everything, coming from the pinball machines to the electromechanical machines, all the way to the beginnings of the video game industry. It was a huge breakthrough for me, because it showed me that game design is so wide open, because it was becoming a little genreification, a little genreified in the kill the alien and shoot it with lasers kind of category back then. So we had this incredible diversity of design back at the beginning of the 80s, and then what happens is the genreification of our entertainment, basically. Our design patterns are having to be genreified now. This was happening, into the probably the mid 80s to the end of the 80s to the beginning of the 90s. And for example, in 1992, we released Wolfenstein 3D, which kind of popularized. It was the beginning of the popularization of the first-person shooter. It wasn't really a genre yet. It was like, hey, here's a cool new game. We had done a couple games that were first person before this point, with Catacomb 3D and Hover Tank, 1991. But not until we actually put a gun in front of you instead of like a wizard's hand or a tank turret, until we actually made you, shooting a gun and gave you the feedback that kind of impacted you, that you actually feel like you shot a gun, and then we put you into a threatening situation that you have, some sort of reference towards? Did that game really, kind of ignite, kind of started something? And then we work on Doom. And then Doom comes out, just a year later, pretty much. And that was, a more sophisticated engine, and it was better design. It was still a pretty minimalist design. We wanted the player. With Wolfenstein, it was all about speed, and that was our filter. The whole game had to filter through a speed filter. If we were putting something in the game and it slowed us down, it needed to get out. And so when we were putting everything in the game, if it passed through the speed filter, it got in the game. And that was, even the secret areas were okay, but stopping and dragging bodies were not okay. And with Doom, when we evolved to Doom, it was, we need to go beyond Wolfenstein, and we need to, make this game fast, obviously, but it also needs to be really scary. And Wolfenstein had its own fear factor in a certain way, but Doom really brought home the fear factor. The really interesting thing about the Doom technology was that engine was pretty much the only engine that did what was called diminished lighting, which means that from the viewer's point, from where the viewer is, the lighting basically got darker automatically in the engine as you go down, further away in distance, and then at some point down the hall, you could see another light that was kind of, was a little brighter. But the engine forced diminished lighting, and it forced the fear factor into the game. So when we allowed the game to be opened up and for people to actually start making levels in it, those levels were pretty much automatically scary already. The game just supported it. And so that, with the new features of Doom, the feeling that you're outside, and with the different, more complex data structures that we created to enable you to navigate mazes that were not blocks like they were with Wolfenstein, that kind of opened up the next, kind of the next level of design. And, it was, everything kind of caught on fire at that point. All of a sudden, there are a lot of, Doom-like clones that were starting to be made. And then we start working on Quake. And we released Quake about 3 years after Doom almost. And that brought really through full 3D instead of the kind of 2.5D that we had done with Quake or with Doom. It brought full 3D, it brought internet multiplayer, which was really important. Because Doom, by the time Quake came out, there had already been an explosion of multiplayer LAN parties and the beginning of some professional playing and some cyber, what were called cyber sports. And then with Quake, that's where kind of it got official, because now people all over the world can easily connect with each other and compete with each other. And now it's a full 3D engine, and it basically is the basic blueprint of the modern fast high-speed action game. And then when Quake came out, it was like a nuke. It went off, and now every game is 3D. I remember in 1996 or 1996, 97, that when Wolfenstein came out and when Doom came out, and you go to E3 and you go to CES and you see the games there, they were still kind of the same kinds of 2D representations or isometrics or whatever. But in 1996, when the year that Quake came out, when I went to E3, that was the year that the entire game industry turned 3D. All of a sudden, we go to the trade show, and everything was in 3D there, and I was really amazed that the transformation happened so quickly, because people jump on this stuff as fast as possible. But the interesting thing is, with this explosion of first-person shooters, we create a genre, and all of a sudden that genre becomes this rigid creative. It's kind of stifling if all you can do is come up with an idea, and a game company is not going to really publish it if it's not a shooter, or if it doesn't kind of adhere to those design patterns that have already been replicated hundreds of times. So it kind of created something cool, and then created a limitation for designers in the future. And not only were first-person shooters, an exploding genre, but we have these other exploding genres that they basically created these same film filters that publishers, they need to recognize what it is. Is it an RPG? Is it a tycoon game? Is it an RTS? Is it an MMO, which is RPG plus something, or casual persistent titles plus something? So, we had this crazy creativity at the beginning of the industry, and then all of a sudden we have a genreification of maybe 5 or 6 main types of games that will be able to get funded, but if you don't have a design that fits these filters that the publishers look for, you're not going to get funded. And then it's kind of up to the IGF in the art game crowd to try and push the boundaries of design, but it's still not crazy, commercial. Just like Farmville explodes. And if you watch Facebook, it is like a nuke went off on Facebook. If you were watching, playing Farmtown, one of the first early farming games, and all of a sudden everybody's jumping on the farming bandwagon, and not only is Farmville, or Farmtown really, the blueprint for farming of the farming games on Facebook, but that blueprint is replicated in other games like Pet Society and Restaurant City and Cafe World and all these other games. They basically take the same mechanic and put a new skin on it, and the explosion of these titles is just all over Facebook everywhere. And that also presents challenges, because if a game designer wants to do something new on Facebook and he goes to a VC and he looks for money, that VC might be deciding that, well, I don't know if I want to fund this game. It's not like Farmville, and look at the numbers on Farmville. That's what I want, and so the success of these things kind of sometimes condemns designers to have to replicate other people's design patterns. Another limitation that we have is APIs, and when a programmer is programming a game, an API actually is a pretty cool thing, because hey, I don't have to write all that sound code myself, and I don't need to write all the code to do polygon rasterization, on the screen, I could go directly to the card with DirectX or OpenGL, or even at a more abstracted layer, I can just make a game inside the Unreal Engine and not have to write all that other code. I can just fill it in with my own designs and stuff in CryEngine 3. But these things basically start to limit us. As we start using these APIs, the more APIs we put between us and the machine, the more limited we are in our expression of art. The fact that back in the early 80s we had frame buffers that we could put any pixel on the screen in any way was actually pretty powerful, compared to the fact that we now have to throw polygons, basically triangle strips, through an API like DirectX. And if you think about the analogy of a painter having to paint with triangles now instead of brush strokes, that's kind of where we've gotten to. All we're doing now is being able to throw more of those triangles to make it look like maybe they are dots. But it is interesting to note that even though we think that it is freeing us to use these engines and these APIs, it's actually still limiting us, and not even to mention the genreification factor that comes into play with these things. So priority one, I think, is let's go back to the founders of these companies that were at the big dawn of this industry, the game industry, and let's spend time and talk to these people that made these products, and try and learn from them what were they thinking, and why did you create, what was Wizardry all about? Why did you make that? Nolan was, it was interesting to see Nolan had basically had popularized Pong, but go talk to Ralph Baer and ask him where his ideas came from. And there's some of these people have been interviewed before, but maybe not to the depth that a graduate student doing a thesis would investigate this stuff. Because I really believe that these people should be studied and have their data warehoused in all of their original papers that they have been keeping, because it kind of does help us look, where things had started and where we're at now. And we need to go back to the beginning, to the beginning of the industry, and let's learn as much as we can, because a lot of things have been, back in the early creativity of the industry, there was an explosion of design patterns, and it would be interesting to go back and kind of investigate that stuff. We're much more constrained today than we were before, even though we might not know it, but we are. There was unbridled creativity at the beginning of the industry, and now unless you're making art games or you're making independent titles, getting something commercially published is a tough task. By technology, by genreification, by APIs, and also by ESRB ratings, we are, and by our obsession with progress, we're limiting ourselves. And we need to go back and talk to the masters who found ways to innovate and inspire within the constraints that they had back then. And maybe ask them, what would you do today? What would you do with these limiting APIs and these limiting, factors that we have to deal with? We need to, talk to these people that tackled every subject, every kind of game design pattern that they could think of. They worried more about play rather than polygons because they really didn't have any polygons back then. They had dots, and they were more worried about how's a dot fun. How's putting a bunch of dots on the screen going to be fun? And we need to do this, before this knowledge is lost, because this industry is, 30 years old, and some of these people are getting older. We need to get on this. We don't want what happened to Mozart to happen to the people like Richard Garriott or the other great designers like Will Wright and the other people that are actively making games now. Not to mention the people that have stopped making games, but they're still around. We need to go talk to them. My design decisions when I'm creating games, the beginning of the shooter, like Ian had mentioned before, I'd been making games since 1979, so when id Software arrived on the scene in 1990, the end of 1990, beginning of 91, I'd been programming for a long time already, and so had John Carmack. Tom Hall had been designing for I believe a decade as well. So it wasn't like we were just a bunch of guys that just kind of got together and figured out how to do this stuff. We'd been making games for a long time. And any time that I'm making design decisions, I'm not only looking at what I've done in the past, but I'm also thinking about, what would this guy had made this game, and he had put this one element that I'm thinking about in the game back in 1984 or whatever. And how is that element implemented, and how can I translate that into my own design? And it's really nice to kind of have a full purview of history in the game industry to kind of know what has been done in as many places as I can investigate to kind of inform a decision whether we are innovating, if I'm coming up with an innovative idea, or if I'm just kind of taking something that I knew was out back in 1982 or something, and just kind of, is it really innovative, or has it been done before? Can I do something brand new or not? What would this person saying Nasser have done with that idea in the way that I'm trying to do it? How would he have kind of incrementally updated that idea, or maybe just completely changed it into something else? So that's what I do when I'm basically doing my design process. I think a lot about history, and I think a lot about how we can move forward and innovate. And I think that's important, and we need to archive it. Thanks. Questions? Anybody has questions?
Hands or microphone?
Microphone is probably better. I can probably hear better with somebody go to the microphone. Unless you can yell. Yelling is cool.
I am Lucas Bradley.
Hello, I'm Lucas Bradley. Had a question in your transition between Doom and Doom 2 into 3D with Quake. And you mentioned that transition, but I'm interested in what you personally were thinking in doing so. Because I remember when all that happened, and I think that on my 486 DX2 at the time, you guys were you were pushing the envelope, and it was very, very cutting edge, and it could have fallen on its face. So in the internal arguments that were, should we keep going with the old and do one more title, or should we switch over to real-time 3D, what was your personal reason for wanting to do it?
Well, so my personal reason for going 3D was that computers had, our processors had gotten to the point where we could actually do it. We had just gotten our, say, Pentium 60s in the office, And while developing the engine, we knew that those P60s were going to be pretty popular in a couple more years later when Quake was going to come out. So technologically, we knew what the next step was, and we needed to push ourselves to not only do the technology to the next level, because it wasn't just us that was creating this new technology. There were other people trying to do it. We were trying to do it at very high speed, which is a very different thing than just kind of throwing it out there. So we had felt that the chip architectures could handle the full 3D of Quake that we were trying to accomplish. And personally, I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to explore a full 3D world. I wanted to actually make a game that with Quake is kind of an interesting topic, because Quake did not turn out the way that I wanted it to turn out. And that basically had to do with the time schedule of creating the game. It took longer than we'd ever taken to make a game. Quake took 18 months, which is, that's like no time now. But back then, Doom was done in 1 year. And so when we had gotten the Quake engine finished, it had already been a year. And the team was, that was a year of insane work. It wasn't just like having fun, we're just kind of throwing an engine together. It was very hard assembly language instructions interlaced with floating point instructions, and it was really difficult work, not only on the programming side, but just on the conceptual side of what are we going to do in this 3D space? It's going to be the next step. And so I had been thinking about what kind of design am I going to be doing in this 3D game? I didn't want to replicate Doom. I didn't want to make another Doom type game. I had really cool 3D, and I wanted to be able to spend the time to not only innovate in our 3D engine, but innovate in our game design. And basically after a year, the whole team was just burnt out, and the prospect of spending who knows how much longer to innovate on design was not appealing to the team. And they were not, it was just a very stressing time, because our team was really small. We had made Doom with 6 people, and we made Quake with 9 people. And and that's 9 people that were very, very good, working extremely hard hours. And that actually does create great art when you're very intense. And because of our inability to push to the next level in game design, we basically decided, let's just take what we did with Doom, which is the first-person shooter weapons, and just put them in Quake. And the game is already going to be awesome with 3D and with internet multiplayer. It's doing so many great things. That's enough. That was kind of enough for us. So personally, I was not as happy to go down that road, but that's what we all decided to do to kind of keep the company intact. But after Quake shipped, half the company left, so id Software had to kind of rebuild, because that's how hard that game was to make.
Thank you.
Hi. Now, I believe your point is something like there's a dearth of innovation, or at least the peril of a dearth of innovation coming up in video game design. And so I guess a question of what exactly would it look like to go back and try and get some sort of really awesome, innovative principles going on in commercial game design? And if it does look like something, I could point to a game, say recently Square Enix did The World Ends With You on the DS, which is kind of an RPG, right? It can fit into the genre, but if you've played it, you realize the combat is like, you're flipping around with the stylus and pressing buttons, and like you eat stuff to get hit point increases. It's kind of innovative in a lot of senses. But what exactly might you point to as an example in contemporary design as something truly, on with innovation?
Well, one of the things that there's going to the full art game side, which is super experimental and might not be commercially successful, but it's interesting to take the chances in design to see if there is an element there that could ignite the mass market into kind of adopting and carrying it forwards into a commercial title. But when I think about design, sure, I can think about crazy, strange, game designs that I just kind of know that that's not going to sell. It's just, it's too weird. It's not a play pattern that people understand. But it's cool, I think, to sneak those into a pattern that people do know. Like when you do design a game, to take some ideas from some of the titles, like, say, there's a game called Contact by Atlas. And it's a quirky little DS game, but it's a really interesting DS game because it does some really, really interesting, fun, strange things that kind of harken back to the early 80s where people were taking chances. And this is a game that was published on a Nintendo DS, which is great. So they could sneak some stuff in there. But I still think that, pushing along mainstream innovative lines the way that, say, Half-Life 2 has delivered, the idea of, like, say, narrative is holding back the flow of a game. That game has really shown that, narrative does not need to pull a game back into, stop cinematic, mode. And I think that was a really important innovation in games, even if the games that followed it didn't copy it. It's an example that the original Half-Life created. Half-Life 2 replicated the same formula as Half-Life 1, just with a better engine and a different story, But it was, a significant commercial title that you could see innovation in it, But it wasn't innovation that was so far off the path that people couldn't recognize it and play it. So, I do believe that making something that a lot of people are going to be able to play and enjoy is important, but also kind of sneaking in any kind of innovation in that design pattern, or maybe just adding something to the side that some people might decide to take and replicate in other titles is important.
Thanks.
So certainly, when you mentioned going back and discussing original and foundational design philosophies, certainly among, I think, contemporary design communities, a bit of fear that, designing a modern game the way an arcade game was, to kill the player in 3 minutes, frustrate and infuriate them. That even designing like a mediumly challenging PC experience for a modern Wii audience will just not not connect with them. And do you feel? The same people today that are growing up with games have a different expectation of what they're trying to do with them. Do you feel like the principles can generalize out beyond the time when they were successful? It's when we see things like the guys at Free Radical, who I loved their work when from GoldenEye up when they were still with Rare out until Time Splitter stuff, fell apart with Haze because it seemed like the philosophy was 4 years old all of a sudden. Does it seem like those can be pulled out of the time when they came out of?
Yeah, there are some ideas that some people experiment with like that if the wrapper is interesting enough, that I think that those patterns can be still replicated, because that has happened multiple times where somebody has implemented something but the game had failed. And the game had failed because of that one interesting thing. It failed because of the wrapper around the game, or maybe there were some technical faults around it. But that's for designers to kind of decide, this was a really interesting thing that Time Splitters did, but, or this other game, Haze, had done this really interesting thing, but it wasn't successful, but it was a really great idea. But if we put it in this setting, we think that we can capture an audience and kind of introduce them to a better version of that design that they had tried to implement. So I think, that still happens. It's not something that when a game dies, nobody does that again. When a game dies, if you're a designer in the industry and you usually know why the thing died, and it's not why, it's a lot of times it's not what people are chatting about in forums and stuff. It's something else. But yeah, that happens all the time though. Some games will do something interesting and they might fail, but those things that are interesting, the other designers in the industry will recognize and try to rev that to be applicable to their title and maybe go a little bit beyond that. So yeah, it's all evolution of design, and everybody tries to borrow from everywhere that they can to try and make their game the best thing that it can. But having it be applicable to their title and fit correctly is kind of a key to it being successful.
Unfortunately, we need to stop there. This room turns into a pumpkin at 8, and so if we don't get out of it,
That's right,
we'll all be pumpkinified.
10 seconds left.
We're starting back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., bright and early. Can I take a quick poll? Is it cold in here, or is it just me? Okay. We'll try to deal with the cold. And for you tweeters who are griping about the flashes, I've talked to the photographers, and we'll keep it a little less annoying tomorrow. So thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
tonight, y'all.